Okay.
Okay, shall I begin?
I welcome to Marx School number 13 and the fourth one in English. Earlier we had about 8 in Sinhala, 1 in Tamil. We started Tamil one only last month and 4 in English. And today we have here Dr. Mahendran Thiruvarangan. He's a senior lecturer in English from Jaffna University.
Probationary, not senior yet.
And okay, he did his first degree, that is BA at Peradeniya University, and then later he did his PhD in the US. He's a regular writer to Colombo Telegraph. In fact, I got your photograph of Colombo Telegraph. And without further ado, I ask Thiru to make his presentation on right of nations to self-determination, reflections on the Tamil question in Lanka. Or Thiru, you can start.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Liyanage, for that introduction. So I don't think I'll speak for 40 minutes. My presentation might be very short. So I thought of dividing this presentation into several sections. So when we think about the right of nations to self-determination, I think it's good to begin by reflecting on the idea of the nation state first, how it evolved and the processes of violence that sat within the formation of nation states, both in Europe and other places. So I thought I would focus on that a bit initially. And then the whole idea of nation and territories and how identities evolved over time. And I would also try to give my remarks on the histories of identities and territories and how these histories were constructed. Because when we talk about the right of nations to self-determination, I think we always keep these histories and histories of identities and territories in mind, and sometimes we just accept the histories that are available to us without problematizing them. And in the third section, I thought I would talk about the narratives of the right of nations to self-determination. You know, there are different ways in which people argue that certain groups are entitled to the right of nations to right to self-determination, and some others are not eligible, and the problems with those categorizations. And then I also thought how this right evolved in 3 different periods. I think immediately after World War I, and then World War II, and then during the period of decolonization. And then I'll talk about the Tamil question in Sri Lanka. So the first part, and I'm going to draw heavily from the work of Mahmoud Mamdani in describing or in talking about these ideas and theories. His forthcoming book, I had an opportunity to read a PDF of it. It appeared on a Facebook page. The book is going to be launched it's going to come out in a week, I think, in a week's time. So this is called Neither Settler Nor Native. And it is in this book he begins his book with a thought-provoking comment that unlike standard European history would tell us, according to him, like, you know, standard European history would tell us that the nation state formation started with the Treaty of Westphalia and how territories were drawn and how a certain kind of stability was achieved in Europe after the 30-year war. But what he does is he locates the origins of the nation state in 1492. And he draws our attention to what happened in Iberia when the Christian Spaniards started a process to create a homogeneous national homeland for themselves. And in this process, they ejected and converted those whom they considered as alien to their nation, namely the Jewish and Moors, Jewish populations and the Moors. So, the major point that he makes is that the whole idea of the nation state started off by excluding and inflicting violence upon people who were considered the other. And I think this process is described in other theories like Stephen Greenblatt, who writes about early modern England, and he writes specifically in relation, with reference to literary writings of the period, and he describes the process of identity formation as self-fashioning. How Europeans and English people thought about themselves and other people in terms of religion, language, and he sees that period in certain ways as contributing to the formation of national identities. So coming back to Mamdani's point, so he sees what happened in during the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia, as a moment to create some kind of tolerance. So the nation state or some form of it had already appeared, but then there was violence and there was a certain need to create tolerance in order to mitigate the violence that the nation state produced. So what happens sometimes is we always focus on this moment of tolerance. That's what Mamdani says. We always focus on the moment of tolerance, and sometimes we think that, this moment, when we locate the origins of the nation state in the moment of tolerance or liberal tolerance, as that's how he puts it, we tend to see, in certain ways, the nation state as some benign force. It's not really violent. It was a creation that happened because of tolerance. So then he makes the point that if we focus on that moment and not what happened prior to that moment, then we will also misunderstand the ways in which cultural, religious identities were politicized, and that process of politicization led to the creation of the nation state. So it was always a hierarchical kind of entity. I think his point is valid, and we saw that even later, but I think even in Europe, even after the Treaty of Westphalia, violence continued in many ways. And then you have, and he also identifies the 1492 moment as having two components. One is this internal ethnic cleansing, whereby the Castilian monarchy sought to create a homeland for Christian Spaniards. And then he also saw that as a moment the Spaniards were trying to find colonies for themselves outside of Europe. So in that sense, he makes the argument that nationalism and colonialism were co-constituting. So there was this earlier argument that nationalism preceded colonialism, or colonialism was seen as the high point of nationalism, but they were actually co-constituting. That is one argument that he makes. And then when he talks about the Treaty of Westphalia, he argues that there was a certain kind of liberal tolerance that was created in Europe, but that liberal tolerance was not extended to communities that were facing colonial exploitation outside of Europe. So the narrative was used in a different way in the context of colonialism. So what he says is, in the colonial context, the Europeans were considered, or they projected themselves as nations, and then the colonized populations were seen as uncivilized masses. So they need to be civilized, and they need to be educated. So the whole colonialist discourse was set in motion during this period. So then he also talks about the ways in which colonial rule was established in these parts. And he talks about two processes. One is called the direct rule, where the civilizing mission was done in a very violent manner, and then that was resisted by the natives. And then there was also an indirect method of colonization, or indirect rule, where certain traditions of the natives were accommodated. So customs, beliefs, so and then there were certain leaders who were chosen so that they would be at a certain level representatives of the different native populations. And he sees that as the process where cultural identities were politicized, and he identifies census and then his writing of history from a colonial perspective, and then the recognition of local laws. So these were the processes that led to the politicization of cultural identities. I think there is also one important point that he mentions. We sometimes think that colonizers actually divided the local populations and then ruled them, but he sees there was a he nuances that argument. He says it's not just dividing and divide and rule, but he describes the process as define and rule. So I would just like to read the relevant quote from the book, where he talks about how he doesn't say that there were no differences when the colonizers entered into these territories. Differences did exist, but the differences were politicized. That is the argument that he makes. So I'll just read this paragraph from the book. The British did not cut the novel identities they exploited from whole cloth. The British noted the real cultural differences among colonized people and even asked them how they identified themselves. The genius of the British was not in inventing differences to exploit, but in politicizing real and acknowledged differences by turning them into legal boundaries deemed inviolable and predicating security and economic benefits on locals' respect for these boundaries. The British thereby co-opted locals into the myth that they were not just culturally different from each other, but in fact had always harbored mutually incompatible interests. In this way, the British Empire took the old Roman strategy of divide and rule a step further. A more apt name for this project is define and rule. So this is a point that Mamdani makes in relation to how these identities were politicized. So, and then, if we look at, a Sri Lankan example, for instance, in contemporary conversations about the right of nations to self-determination, or the Tamil nation's right to self-determination, there is always this one paragraph from a colonial minute that is always cited, or most of the time we see this. But this is from Sir Cleghorn's minutes, and this is another quote that I would like to read. This is how Cleghorn understood the island. So he wrote, two different nations from a very ancient period have divided between them the possession of the island. First, the Sinhalese inhabiting the interior of the country in its southern and western parts, and secondly, the Malabars who possess the northern and eastern districts. These two nations differ entirely in their religion, language, and manners. But we know that this history is very problematic, and our historians who studied the history of this island and its various populations and cultures would say completely different things, right? And the borders were not so rigid like he has mentioned in his minutes. And there were interactions across these communities, and also even the labels, right? The Sinhala, Tamil, and he also used the label Malabars, right? So, these were all labels to a certain extent, were invented by the British. So we have, I think, with regard to the problem of history, or with regard to history and the history of identities and history of our territories, there are two problems that I think we have to deal with. I think one is there are histories that were, in a way, inaccurate, our local historians in many ways disagreed with these histories, and they identified moments of interaction, cross-pollination, that is one. And then the question of epistemology, how these identities were created, how these identities were given certain names, and how these identities were brought into processes of governance and state making. So I would like to read like another example. This is by Professor Padmanathan, who delivered the Chancellor's address at the University of Jaffna last year, and this is from his address. And this is this lecture is on the Kandyan Kingdom. So I just wanted to read it in juxtaposition to what the Cleghorn Minute says. So this is about the Kandyan Kingdom, and this is what Padmanathan says. There was considerable diversity in ethnicity and cultural distinctions were highlighted by regional variations. So he's talking about the regional variations within the Kandyan Kingdom. The core region, the Pasrata, and the vast lands on the sloping areas around it were predominantly occupied by Sinhalese, who were also Buddhist. In the eastern littoral stretching from Pulmotai to Panama was inhabited by Tamils and Muslims. Tamils and Muslim settlements were concentrated around ports and other centers of commercial activities. In the central highlands and the Disavanis of north central plains, the king was looked upon as the patron and custodian of Buddhist institutions and Sinhalese tradition. But in the eastern littoral that was divided into a number of chiefdoms, the king was the patron of Hinduism and the custodian of customs and traditions of Tamil society. It may be emphasized here that the Kandyan state was not an ethnocracy, nor was it a theocracy. It was inspired by the traditional norms of Dharma in southern societies, which emphasized the custodial functions of the monarch. These transcended ethnic and sectarian barriers. The traditions of coexistence, cooperative endeavor, and partnership developed under the Kandyan monarchy laid the foundations for internal peace and harmony that had become exemplary and contributed immensely to stability and solidarity among divergent groups of people within the kingdom. So I just wanted to highlight it because just to suggest, like, how Padmanathan presents a very different picture of the island, at least during the Kandyan period. But then there is also a problem that I see here too, that all these labels, Hinduism, Tamil, Sinhala, Buddhist, did these labels, does he use these labels anachronistically, or whether some form of these labels existed during the Kandyan Kingdom? I think that is a question that we have to explore carefully. I don't have an answer, but scholars like Mamdani, who studied the histories of modern identities, as he studied these identities, the identities in Africa especially. So he makes the point how colonialism contributed to the formation of these identities. So even in Sri Lanka, I'm not sure, I'm not very familiar with scholarship on the histories of identities. Maybe that's an area that would help us understand this issue in a better light, I would say. So you can see, one is the problem with regard to writing of history, and then the epistemologies that were that historians produced, then colonial rulers produced, and how do we address the question of epistemology? So why I wanted to mention these the histories of identities and territories is, when we enter into conversations about the right of nations to self-determination or the struggles around the right to self-determination, I think we enter there with this baggage, right? We have certain notions about history, certain notions about our identities, and we also have certain notions about our territories, and we call for self-determination without problematizing these histories and identities. So that is why I think understanding these histories and identity, the histories of these identities and territories is very important. So sometimes we say that, Tamils have a national consciousness, but how did this national consciousness emerge? How did colonial processes contribute to the emergence of this national consciousness? So at the base or at the core, I think what one might locate is politicization of cultural identities that started. It might have been there even prior to the arrival of colonizers, but politicization of cultural identities is something that we have to always take into consideration, because we sometimes think that cultural identities are natural, or using culture for political ends is a very natural process, or that is the only way in which we can do politics. Sometimes we think like that. So understanding and unpacking the histories of these identities and territories is essential in that sense. So the next point is we have to, like, the various theories about self-determination. There is the 5-point thesis that I think Stalin developed, that you need to have a contiguous territory, then you have to have a language, culture, a common economy, a certain kind of consciousness. So these are considered as elements that would make a community a nation. But I think what one needs to understand here is that unlike the nation, territories are complex entities and impure, and they are always already contaminated. And we will see, like, minorities living within minorities, and people would come, people would leave. So the identities of the territories always change, and it is very difficult to reduce the identity of a territory to a single locus, right? Like Tamil or Muslim or Sinhala or Buddhist. It's difficult, because even if you look at the north, you have Muslim populations, you have Sinhala populations. So that is another point, I think, that sometimes we tend to overlook. And then we talk about consciousness, right? Sometimes people, in a way, nowadays, I think some nationalists don't want to give importance to these criteria formulated by Stalin, but they want to talk about consciousness. So if you think you are a nation, then you are entitled to the right to self-determination. But then, as I said earlier, even the whole idea of consciousness comes through a long process, and sometimes our national consciousness is a reflection of certain colonial processes. So if we want to think about decolonization, and if we want to understand the relationship between right of nations to self-determination and decolonization, then if we are not willing to question how we arrived at this consciousness, I think that's a problem. Then we are not really participating in a process of decolonization. So the criteria is also a problem, but then there are different ways in which people want to deal with it. I think even Shanmuga Dasan, when he in the 70s or 80s, before 1983, clearly he said that the Tamils don't satisfy the economic criteria. So then he says they are not entitled to consider themselves as a nation. But later on, after the 83 violence, then he becomes a supporter of the right to self-determination project. And then there are others who want to give importance to consciousness and not anything else. So that criteria question is also something that we have to understand and unpack, I think. The next point that I would like to present is the histories of the right of nations to self-determination. So this is where, we may say that we can locate the antecedents of the right of nations to self-determination, maybe in the Westphalia Treaty. But as a right, I think it was developed in an enthusiastic manner during World War I or in the aftermath. That's when the Austro-Hungarian Empire faced a crisis, and as a solution to the conflicts within this empire, Woodrow Wilson and those who were aligned with him suggested this idea that, each of these communities or most of these communities will have, if they have their own nation states, then the problem will be solved. So, so that's when it was promoted. I think maybe the first instance in the early 20th century. But what happened afterwards was they faced another problem. Now you have created all these nation states in Eastern Europe, but then you didn't know how to address the minorities question. So these countries also had minority populations, and then there were huge population transfers. So, so those processes, how to handle the minorities became a question, and as a result, the League of Nations came up with a minority rights treatise, because they immediately found the national self-determination goal as one that had its limitations. So that's in World War, during World War, after World War I. And then the other problem, another problem that happened after World War II was that after the defeat of the Nazis, there was ethnic cleansing of Germans from Eastern European territories. So not just Germans, this is, if you read Mark Mazower's book, No Enchanted Place, where he talks about all these different moments. So when he writes about what happened after World War II, so he says, at liberation, expulsions not only of Germans, but also of Ukrainians, Poles, and others in Eastern Europe were widely seen as the lesser evil and were condoned by the Allies and Stalin. So this is an interesting point, because all these people supported national self-determination, but then they were kind of fine with certain populations becoming minorities. So the principle of national self-determination, it generated its hierarchies. Certain populations were identified as nations, certain populations were identified as minorities, and then where do minorities, where can they be sent? That was another question that all these people faced, and it's and Mazower makes a very interesting point here. Let me find it. Right. So he says, faith in international law was badly dented, and across the board, the UN retreated from the interventionist approach that had characterized the League. So when the League of Nations was in operation, they took the minorities issue seriously. But that didn't happen when the UN was founded after World War II. The retreat from minority rights formed part of this phenomenon in the scrapping of the minorities treaties and the evisceration of the Genocide Convention. Minorities were now seen as sources of destabilization, and liberals and socialists were as passionate in demanding their eradication as fascists. So, like, in a way, like even the liberals and the socialists were also, like, in their haste to support the right of nations to self-determination, they overlooked the minorities problem. And when I mentioned Woodrow Wilson and World War I forgot to mention Lenin. Right? Lenin was also passionately advocating the right of nations to self-determination, and there was also a debate within the socialist camp between Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg on the question of the right of nations to self-determination. Luxemburg, for instance, argued, whose nation are we talking about here? Like, and the internal divisions within the nation along lines of class, and whether it is right to support this sort of bourgeois nationalist kind of project. So that was a question that Rosa Luxemburg argued, but Lenin's point was, I think, he saw the recognition of the right of nations to self-determination and the formation of nation states with one language and one market would accelerate the growth of capitalism, and as a result, the class contradictions will become sharper, and that would lead to the creation of socialism. So he saw the recognition of the right of nations to self-determination as a pathway to socialism. So that was like, World War I, and then World War II, the point that I just made, based on what Mark Mazover mentions in his book, how Germans, Ukrainians, and Polish people were all rendered minorities after World War II. And then you have the decolonization project in the formerly colonized countries, and there are also people passionately call for self-determination. And there again, Mazover makes an interesting observation. Initially, there were anti-colonial movements that were interested in Pan-Africanism and Pan-Arabism, but later on, there were nationalist tendencies and everybody wanted to have a nation state. And then we know the nation states were created, but in places like Biafra, Morocco, Eritrea, and Bangladesh, there were again another wave of nationalism and another cycle of calls for national self-determination. So it was in a way like, people continue to politicize identities, cultural identities, as a way of demanding statehood or some form of self-determination. So this is, I just wanted to give these as my own historical and theoretical reflections based on what Mamdani and Mark Mazover present in their work. But to focus on the Tamil question, I think we have to look at it in I think two different ways. One is the whole nationalist aspiration. I think it comes from two processes, and I think at one point they converge. So the rise of a English educated middle class, and then and certain kinds of that happened in the northern part of the country, and then also the post-independence violence against the minorities and the Tamils, and how the post-independence state become a Sinhala Buddhist state, right? Even in 1948, the plantation Tamil communities were disenfranchised, and then in 1956 you have the Sinhala only, then the foremost place given to Buddhism in the 1972 constitution. And then, so in a way, there was this aspiring middle class that had political ambitions, one, and then Tamils were also facing marginalization. So I think it is at this point, the demand for self-determination becomes important and becomes a key political demand. And we also know that I think the Communist Party also supported the Tamils' right to self-determine. They were the first to say that there were two nations, or like Tamils are entitled to the right to self-determination during the colonial era. So I think we should also recognize how political theory also in certain ways influenced the demand for self-determination. Like, the left sometimes, since it is seen as part of its canon, right, literature. So if a community makes the right to self-determination, sometimes the left thinks that it needs to be supported. So that is also there. But how the post-independence state developed, and the violences that it produced, and the legislation that it produced, I think these are all factors that contributed to the demand for self-determination of the Tamil nation in the northeast of the island. And then that struggle took different forms. I think I don't need to go into that. I think everybody is familiar with that, like, the so-called Ahimsa struggles led by the Tamil Arasu Katchi Federal Party, or ICHAC, and then the armed struggle started. Then you have, like, I think one important moment in this struggle that I would like to capture, that is the eviction of the Muslims from the north. So you can see, like, while there is this demand for self-determination and a separate Tamil nationhood, even as this struggle was underway, a population within the so-called Tamil homelands was evicted in mass. by the liberation tigers of Tamilnadu. So that in a way tells us, right, the right of nations to self-determination, its limits, like, you might make these claims, but then what about those people who live within your within the territories that are associated with your nation or your homelands, and what is the status of those populations? I think that is a question that we have to always ask. And then if you look at the Northeast today, according to the census 2012, I think it's the Tamil, so-called Sri Lankan Tamil population. Again, I'm using these census categories, which I said, like, we all have to call into question, but these are the labels with which we have to work now. So that is 60%. So 40% of the population in the Northeast is not Tamil right now. And state-sponsored colonization schemes also led to a rise in the Sinhala populations in the Northeast. That needs to be acknowledged too. And then if you look at the rest of the island, and if we are going to look at the whole ethnic conflict as a problem that involves not just Tamils but also other minority communities, the latest census report says that 30% of the Sri Lankan Tamils actually live outside the Northeast. And then 2/3 of the total Muslim population in the country live outside the Northeast. And then I think a huge majority of the Malayaha Tamil community also live outside the Northeast. So the question is, can the right to self-determination of the Tamils or a self-determination project that takes place in the Northeast be a solution to the violence and exclusions that Tamils face in post-colonial or post-independent Sri Lanka or today's Sri Lanka? Right? So I think there are limits. So that's why I think the whole idea of self-determination and national self-determination, we have to recognize the flaws in this project. I think people demanding autonomy is a good thing, and people having people on the peripheries can manage their lives and resources. That needs to be supported. But I think ethnicity alone cannot be, or a single ethnic identity alone cannot be the basis to make such claims. Right? If we are going to think about autonomy or land powers in the Northeast or land police powers in the Northeast, once those powers are obtained, once a structure is created, either it could be a separate nation state or a province, I think those powers will affect everybody in that region. So when you say that, this is our homeland and this is our state, the question of belonging again excludes people. So how are we going to address that question, right? Even if we want to support regional autonomy, I think we should also think about plurality at various levels, not just at the national level or at the macro level, but also within the peripheries, within the provinces. So that is another concern I thought I would raise here. But at the same time, the demand for autonomy, the demand for devolution, it is also now like, people frame this whole self-determination project in different terms also, right? Almost all the political parties all the Tamil nationalist political parties in the island, now they openly say they don't want a separate state. What they call for is internal self-determination, right? Their argument is that within a united country, the provinces need to be given certain powers in such a way that those powers cannot be taken back by the center unilaterally. So that is what is now considered. Some people call it federalism, some people call it devolution, some people call it internal self-determination. So that's how it is framed now. But the question is, like, how that demand interacts with various communities that live inside the Northeast. And I would also mention that there is also a lot of opposition to the merger of the North and East provinces. So whether those provinces need to be merged or not, like there needs to be a dialogue on that. So even if if these two provinces are going to be divided as they are now, again, there are also questions related to caste, class, and gender. So if we are talking about land powers, but then there are also landless populations. Historically, these populations have been landless because of their caste identities. So how land powers, how provinces getting land powers would impact redistribution of land within a province, and how it would lead to addressing problems related to social and economic inequalities, gender inequalities. I think these are also questions that need to be foregrounded, even as we discuss the demand for autonomy or demand for devolution. So with that note, I think I would end, and we can discuss these issues.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And now it's open for discussion. We have exactly 1 hour and 8 minutes for discussion. Anybody? Someone should start.
I have a question. I'm just starting.
Sumadi.
I'm just starting. It's not anything very profound. It's something that Thiruvarangan has already mentioned. So you think that nation state formations and self-determination is a washing of hands by, I'm also thinking of dominant thinking in Sri Lanka, a kind of dominant thinking, and dominant thinking in terms of self-determination, is deflecting responsibility. Particularly kind of from a majoritarian perspective. A lot of times Lenin is quoted, but I think the Soviet Republic, whatever, they had a huge imperial problem, right? So I mean, so then that's a little different from our post-colonial histories, and so that's what I took from your talk. If we look at then my question is to do with majority minority, and at one time we were wondering about, we were talking about creating a minority consensus, and using the idea of minority as a productive, liberatory, or as a resistant category. Would you think that's a possible way? Because then it filters down to so many different minorities and not stuck in the nation.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think a minority consensus might also lead to the democratization of the state, and how we understand territories. Sometimes the whole minority idea is also stuck within the Northeast, and we are the Tamils are the majority. So what happens outside the Northeast is a question, and then there are also people who have to, for various reasons, they may not want to live there permanently outside the Northeast, but still for various reasons may be living there. And then I think the minorities outside the Northeast also faced many problems during the ethnic violence of 56, 77, 83. It was those minorities who were affected. And even issues related to archaeology and other issues, I think there are problems outside the North and East too. So, a minorities consensus, I think in that sense is important. It helps us understand minorities. I think it should help us understand the experiences of the minorities at different levels, I think. So, did I respond?
I mean, this is just a little input, intervention from my. The other day, I was trying to imagine. I mean, this is kind of funny. Please bear with me. It's a little story, my imagination. I was trying to figure out how, if the Sinhala Buddhists were a minority, I'm a small minority, they are quaint, and I'm walking by the temple. There's a temple close where they have the chant, and I'm like, how sweet and how cute, and this is very nice and all that. How would it be? How do you see that? I was trying to empower myself through that imagination. I'm stopping there. I should not talk so much.
Yeah, but I think the if you look at the north, when the I don't know which of these two, one the TRC commission and then the constitutional panel, they visited the north. So the population in Velioya, they had their grievances too, like in Mullaitivu, Kacheri, they find it difficult to get things done in Tamil. So I think in different locations, I think if you look at the north from the angle of Muslims and Sinhalese, I think again you will see a very different picture, maybe, no?
No, I think it's different. I think about Muslims, yes, but not. I think, and I like in my childhood, the Sinhala population in Jaffna is different from the Sinhala population today in the north.
Right.
And I think it's not other. The Sinhala population, I feel, is not othered
But
in the same way. At least I'm talking of Jaffna town.
okay.
Value and all that, I don't know. Yeah.
Because during the war years, they also, like, in one of the UTHR reports, the Sinhala settled populations, they were talking about their experiences and the violence that they faced from the military, for instance. So they were complaining that they were used as basically human shields, and they were wondering whether the army was protecting them or they were protecting the army. And then the women were sexually harassed by the military. So those narratives also figure.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. I'm going to need to clarify myself. I'll just take this moment and then shut up.
No.
I did not mean I did not want to say that. I was not saying that these communities, Sinhala communities, are not marginalized.
Yeah.
But whether they are the other of the Tamils in the way the Muslims are the other of Tamils, or you're like you see a koil and say how nice this koil is, and it has this nice colors, and I will go one day and visit this koil. I mean, it's in that respect.
Maybe it depends on the number also. Maybe like.
And I'm sure the LTT othered them and massacred those communities. I mean, I can see that. But what I'm saying is, my theoretical point is, if the Sinhala
Your mic is muted.
The thinking of themselves as minorities, maybe that's also a way to go. I mean, that was my theoretical point.
Any other questions or comments? Okay.
Ridley has something, I think.
Okay.
Just can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right. Just to try to clarify the nation state, the self-determination of nations, the right of self-determination of nations.
Little louder.
The right of self.
Little louder.
I think when Lenin pronounced the right of self-determination of nations, that included the right of self-determination of national minorities somewhere. It's not only limited to nation states, but nations within the national state. Yeah, because especially even after the Soviet the Constitution of the Soviet Union included the right of nations to self-determination, including secession, the right of secession. Yeah, even seceding from the Soviet Union. So that, I think, needs to be clarified. So it was not merely in the interest of promoting class struggle within bourgeois states, but even within the socialist states, Lenin had accepted the right of nations to self-determination, including secession. In fact, the first declaration of on the eve of the October Revolution was, apart from the decree of peace and lands to peasants, which also included the right of nations like the Ukraine, Polish nations to secede if they wanted to from the Soviet. In the midst of a war, within an imperious war, Lenin's first declaration included the right of nations to self-determination. So that I just want to clarify that point was not merely in the interest of class struggle.
Yeah, but I think the point that I was trying to make was, it was again, there was a certain way in which hierarchies were created again, like, you know, who is a nation, who is a minority, and then, like, you know, and that works at a constitutional level, at a legal level, maybe it works in a certain manner, like, you know, people might say that in a way all are treated equal, or there are certain kind of rights and protections that are guaranteed. But I think there is also this problem, how, like, you know, when one community is called the nation and the others are considered minorities, then the question of belonging comes in. Then there is a hierarchy. Then people understand it differently. Like, you know, even when we talk about the self-determination in the Northeast, sometimes in political platforms, sometimes I hear people saying that only Tamils here have the right to self-determination and others can live here. So that is very similar to the Sinhala nationalist kind of rhetoric, like, you know, this is a Sinhala Buddhist nation, but other people can live here, kind of thing. So that we don't seem to be like dismantling that hierarchy. It's getting reproduced in other ways. That's what
because even if you even if you establish socialism, the national, you know, the chauvinist attitude or the dominant nation doesn't disappear straight away. So that is why Lenin had to accept that, because especially on if you aware of this, on the Georgian question, when this Georgian incident happened under Stalin, they had sort of ordered there was some physical violence against members of the government there in Georgia under Stalin, and then Lenin took offense with Stalin, where he he disagreed with the actions taken by Stalin and the war commissariat there. And that was, I mean, Lenin was particularly emphasizing that, I'm trying to get a quote from this, but on that incident, this happened this was in 1922, and where I'm just quoting Lenin now, what is important for the proletarian? For the proletarian, it is not only important, it is absolutely essential that he should be assured, that is the non-Russians, that the non-Russians place the greatest possible trust in the proletarian class struggle. What is needed to ensure this? Not merely formal equality. In one way or another, it is necessary to compensate the non-Russian for the lack of trust, for the suspicion and the insults to which the government of the dominant nation subjected them in the past. So that is what Lenin tried to emphasize, the attitude of the proletariat in the revolutionary in terms of national minorities. And then he further goes on to say that it is necessary, it is better to overdo rather than underdo in providing concessions or having a lenient attitude to national minorities. So I just want to clarify.
Any other?
Skanda Kumar wanted to come.
Who?
Skanda Kumar wanted to say something.
Okay, Kumar. Kumar, you can raise your question.
Yes, thank you. I hope I can be
We
heard
can't
now.
hear.
We can't hear you properly.
Probably Kumar?
Hi, is this any better?
No.
A little better.
Yeah.
Better. Any
No.
better now? No, no.
No. Be closer to the microphone.
I can hear you because I'm using
can
my headphones. Yeah. So go ahead. Then I'll.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, Kumar, start.
Okay, yeah. So, really, where I'm coming from is because this, this forum is the Marx school, right? So,
Yeah.
so the idea is that so it's a kind of a it's already got its boundaries and its kind of texts and themes. So I confess I am disappointed that you didn't really expand on the Lenin Luxembourg debate, because honestly I still feel that and everything that you said subsequently really comes back to that. And I could have done with less Mamdani and whom I like for other reasons, and more for this particular forum from comrades Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg. So, but I just wanted to pick up three themes which I felt need to be separated a little.
Right.
And my concern is Thira, that many of us who are Tamil Marxists and who are Tamil Marxists or Tamil leftists who are completely opposed to the Tamil nationalism of our recent past, that experience, which of course is real, then colors or filters the way in which we come to some of these historical questions. So for me, for example, really there are three things that need to be separated here. One is I think there needs to be there needs to be a factual or fair representation of what Lenin actually means when he talks about the right to self-determination. And likewise, of course, to understand the very powerful arguments made by Rosa Luxemburg, right? And I still feel that so many decades on, that if you're looking from within the Marxist tradition, which of course, as you point out, is not the only tradition by which to understand the question of nationalism and self-determination, we still, it's these two canonical figures who are so important. Secondly, I think something that I disagreed with your treatment of too is your again in passing, en passant comments on the left in Sri Lanka on the national question. Because again, I think it conflates the circles that we are familiar with, or who are perhaps we think are closest to us from the 90s, 80s, 90s and onwards, with the left in Sri Lanka from the mid 1930s, right? Which is how you've got to look at the evolution of the idea. And the third one is, of course, the concrete question, which is the Tamil national question in Sri Lanka, right? So all I'm saying is that these three, I felt got kind of collapsed in each other. That you could take a certain have a certain understanding of the historical debates in that First World War period between Lenin, Luxemburg, and others. You could then look at how the left understands the national question in Sri Lanka from the 1930s onwards. And then thirdly, you come to the Tamil national question and how the left responded or reacted or not. Now, I just want to. I'm not going to try and do this, but I'm just going to. I just want to make a couple of observations for the record, please. So one is that there's nothing. It is still a very elegant text, Lenin's Right of Nations to Self-Determination, and still elegant because of the simplicity and clarity of the argument that he makes, which is that in order for nations to live together in equality, you cannot say to one that it has no right to be separate or apart from the other, right? So the analogy that's often used is like a marriage. You can't say this is a marriage of equals, but hang on, if you want to exit, there is no exit. We've got to somehow figure out that equality within this institution of marriage or within the institution of the nation state, for example. And I'd like to please point out one very important thing, which is that Lenin never says, and this is the difference between the Tamil nationalists, right, who are not Marxists. Simply because you quote Lenin, Anton Balasingham quotes Lenin, does not make either the LTT or anybody else Marxist. It's only because Anton Balasingham, had read that. So when Lenin says the right to self-determination, he does not mean that the right to self-determination equals secession,
Yeah.
separation.
Yeah.
Now that's how Tamil nationalists understand it, right? But he makes the very important point, which I agree with him on, that you can't say to somebody, right to, yes, you can have all the self-determination you like, you can have all the freedom you like, except the freedom to actually leave, to walk away. And if you deny somebody that freedom, then all these other talk of freedom is really cosmetic. It's bogus, right? So that's just an observation on that. And again, for the record, I'd like us not to overstate the actual influence of Lenin's position on the in the tragic history of 20th century Marxism, because as you yourself pointed out, actually Lenin's own policy was not the policy followed by the USSR. In fact, it was not even followed in the USSR during Lenin's lifetime, right? Although the constitution of the USSR did include the right to secession, it was never intended to be actually activated or used. And remember that the French Communist Party resisted the struggle for independence in Algeria because they were determined to fight for apparently the equality of the Algerians within the French Republic or state, which was again, of course, a travesty. The second point I want to make is that actually, what was the position, what has been the mainstream position of the left in Sri Lanka on the right to self-determination? As you point out, Thierry, yes, we do have this one instance of the Communist Party in 1944 proclaiming the right to self-determination, but that is it. That is where it began, and that is where it ended, Thiru. The majority of the left movement in this country from the 1940s up till today, and the majority of the left are not the groups you and I might think of as being our close allies, right? It's not NDP, ML, and it's not small Trotskyist groups. The majority of the left is anything from the JVP to the CP to the LSSP to whatever. Remember, none of them have ever argued in favor. In fact, none of them have even expressed, even debated, other than Vijay Veera briefly, the right to self-determination. So actually, when you talk about the left having this position, it's not the left in its majority. It's these small groups of Trotskyists and Maoists, and they themselves coming to this position belatedly. They themselves coming to this position not because they had some kind of Leninist bug in them, right? No, they come to this because the Tamil nation demands its right to self-determination through the 1970s. And under the force of that, even before 1983, you see some evolution. The NSSP taking up this position, and only much late in the early 80s, you see, for example, Balatampo's group and others taking this up as well. So not because of Lenin, but because of the concrete Tamil national question, right? So that the position of the left in Sri Lanka has in fact been your position, Thiru. Your position is the Luxembourgist position, which is for autonomy rights, which is for the power sharing and devolution of power and coming to some arrangements, but within some kind of Sri Lankan state. And so, and the final thing is the one I just wanted to say on the Tamil national question, which is that the point that the point about Marxism is that it is not timeless or ahistorical, right? And this is why it is correct that when we talk about these debates and issues, we apply them to concrete or specific instances. So that's why Ridley talked about the Georgian question and so on, because it is only through those actual conflicts that you begin to see a development of thought or theory, of course, right? You can't just develop it like you do, a holy text written 2,000 years ago and valid for all time. So on the Tamil national question, it is only correct that in fact you see an evolution of the left position on this. As late as in the 1960s and 1970s, even those on the left of the LSSP, like Karalasingham and others, do not support the right to self-determination. They do not even use this term. They talk about what you use, minorities. They talk about it as the minority question. So it is only when the Tamil question presents itself, and you have to recognize, and we have to recognize that this was true before 1983, it was true during the war, and it is true now, that there is a consciousness among that group of people of being a nation. That consciousness exists. We cannot, simply because we are so repelled by those who claimed to represent it and who devastated that society and so many lives, that we refuse to see what face, what stares us in the face, which is the existence of a Tamil nation. That does not mean that there's an easy answer what you do, but I'm simply insisting that just because we don't like the evolution or face of Tamil nationalism, that we deny the existence of something called a Tamil nationality and a Tamil national consciousness. Thank you so much for your patience.
So to respond to the first question about the Luxembourg Lenin debate, like I didn't go into it, I mentioned it briefly. But I thought, what I was interested in was, I think this is again, sorry for bringing in Mamdani again. And what he says is the way the whole idea of self was conceived and the whole idea of nation was conceived in these theories. He sees there is a certain kind of essentialism about the nation, about the territory, that both liberals and Leninists share. So that's why I thought I wanted to highlight that one. And then the USSR had its own empire and they had to manage their empire. So these were all we nowadays we consider them as rights, but then they were all evolved in a certain political context. So so that's one thing. And then the next point about the left in Sri Lanka, I agree with your comments that the positions evolved and positions changed. And then, there is a certain section of the left that continues to be singular nationalist. So that I agree, but I don't see myself as promoting this minority rights paradigm. I think what I try to suggest is that the nation minority distinction is something that we need to problematize and question. So that's what I wanted to say. So let's say even if there is a separate state in the north and east, is it going to be a state of the Tamils, so Tamil nation? What about other people? If there is a project that becomes successful in that region. So those are the questions that I want to raise. And then your last point, I think it does exist, maybe a Tamil national consciousness, but I just wanted to see the processes that shape that consciousness and how it evolved. And I think there is also a need to denaturalize it. So that's what I wanted to highlight. Yeah.
Any other?
Hi, Thiru.
Hi.
Yeah.
You have a question?
Hi.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the talk. And my question is about what kind of, you talked about shaping consciousness and how consciousness has been shaped in decolonial movements during colonization and so on. And what you pointed out is that every decolonial movement so far in Sri Lanka and many other contexts has been recolonization, right? If we talk about privatization of Buddhism through the constitution, the language policy, and so on. And also within communities, we have issues of power, right? Unequal distribution, like if you look at power hierarchically. But I'm wondering, in terms of shaping consciousness, is there any movement, grassroots kind of movement, which kind of tries to educate the public in terms of an anti-violent kind of consciousness shaping, in terms of like identities as fluid, emerging, as Prasvarakrama says, becoming, right? This we don't see this kind of education. What we encounter is these polar opposite identities, right, throughout this in the post-colonial era. But are you aware of some kind of movement in Sri Lanka? I'm not talking about North, you being Tamil and so on. I'm talking about Sri Lanka against militarization. That's a huge question, because we can't, it seems, Rajapakshas are continuously teaching us good lessons that we can't work, particularly minorities, can't work with these minority identities. I don't know whether Sriak's argument about strategic use of essentialism would also work in the times of Rajapakshas. But I'm just wondering whether you are aware of something in your practice as a teacher. What do you do in your classrooms to kind of shape this consciousness of your students and so on?
I don't know. There may be movements. I can't immediately think of any movements such. But I think sometimes the kind of education we receive at our universities, I think it is still very good in certain ways, right? So we learn about how identities take shape, how identities are evolving, and all these struggles, right? So I think that education happens, but I don't know at other levels whether we see that, I don't know, maybe it happens in some departments, not in others, right? But at the high school level, our history textbooks are very nationalistic, and then identities are all reduced to some boxes, right? Compartmentalized. So it happens in these two ways, I think. But I think understanding the history and histories of identities is, I think, it's going to be very important, right? Otherwise, that lesson, I think, needs to be given a central place in what we teach. But I think there is a long way to go in that sense, I would say. Yeah.
Who is next?
Thank you very much, Thiru, for your wonderful presentation and introduction to Mamdani. I really love to read the book. So my question is taking define and rule, right? Like we see it's still happening, and polarization is between ethnic groups is heightening. So, and I mean, it also accompanies this suppression of heterogeneous identities, like you said, minorities, particularly, right? And people with different identities, they are forced to ascribe to the bigger identities. So what kind of, as people working in the left, right? What kind of struggles or possibilities for resistance do you see emerging in this process?
I think we are facing a moment of polarization, I think, now. But there are also struggles that cut across all these national or ethnic boundaries, like the struggle for free education, the struggle for free health, and high wages. So I think these are moments, I think, that may bring us together. But again, I think there is also a need to, I don't see only just using these struggles to build some kind of unity. I think there is also a need to recognize how nationalism has infiltrated into our societies, and how it exists even among people who struggle for free education, or people who struggle for free healthcare, but they are not entirely free of this nationalism, and they are also in a way vulnerable to this polarization. I think we need to recognize. So for that, there is a lot more work to be done, and we need more campaigns, people talking, debating issues related to nationalism and ethnic polarization. So that has to happen. But I think maybe when repression becomes more severe, there will be more room for solidarities and dialogue. But again, what we are going to talk about in those venues and in those instances is going to determine whether there will be a formidable resistance to nationalism and ethnic polarization. So there are areas where people can work together, I think. But again, it's also important that we have conversations about how our state is hierarchized in an ethnic, religious, and cultural sense. So that conversation, I think, needs to happen.
Thank you, Thiru.
Can I say something, if that's all right?
Sivyanga, yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you can.
Well, Thiru, first of all, sorry, I'm not showing my face.
No, that's fine.
Not in a position to do that, just to kind of channel a few ideas, because we were talking about right to self-determination, and just two observations that I saw in the Sri Lankan parliament recently regarding two politicians, I believe, representing the North and the East. One is the instance where one parliamentarian referred to Tamil, the language, as one of the oldest language of the island, which kind of created a furor in public media. And then the case to do with the second parliamentarian from the Eastern Province, as far as I remember, representing the IT AK, who actually spoke in both Sinhalese and Tamil, parliamentarian called Rajaputran, I think his name is. So now these two incidents taken together with the observation you made about how the demographics are changing within what has traditionally been considered majority Tamil regions, how people have been moving about, and where you referred to demographics of an X number of people living outside the North and East, so on and so forth, right? Now, I take this as one premise, and I would like to place it side by side with what I consider is the state prerogative, either through colonization schemes or by carrying out protracted warfare, which is to appropriate the land of certain regions, which includes the North and the East. So we have two movements where people are moving out, and then there is a concentrated, self-consciously orchestrated state agenda through which the territory, as well as I would say the ideological grounds of a particular region, is being manipulated, appropriated, and manned for over 3 decades. Now, these are two realities we have as we go into a new decade. Now, parallel to that, there is also what we consider generally the transnational state, which is, I think, over the last 3 decades, it has been growing. And when we look at the news, we see either it could be second generation migrants or exiles from, well, for the want of a word, the Tamil homeland, and other activists who are actually building a very strong nexus within this transnational territory, if I might call it that. So now what I want to ask you is, Thiru, this is more a practical, a kind of a practical intervention you can make, is as to how the imagination of territory. It could be in Jaffna, the northeast where you are, or in general, the kind of ideological terrain you occupy. How do you see the idea of territory changing in order to include all those changes we see in the physical geopolitical space of Sri Lanka, but also not to leave out the ideological territory to which the transnational Tamil discourse can also be fit in? Do you see a consciousness of this larger extended domain entering the day-to-day discourses where you are? Or do you see that this might have some kind of currency or relevance as we go into a new decade? I am really hoping that I kind of made myself clear. If I haven't, please let me know so I can maybe say it a second time in a hopefully in a better way.
About the transnational point, are you referring to Tamil diaspora or?
Well, what people generally call,
Okay,
especially
right.
Sinhalese nationalists, but
Right.
I would go beyond that. I'm speaking about the research that is being done, the kind of academic discourses that are available, not only the political activism, but the larger organized systematic ground that is developing outside the geopolitical space we call Sri Lanka. Yeah.
Right. I think, again, I think you would see a variety. I think there are people who study this region and its conflicts and capture all the nuances in their work. But I would just speak about, like, what I see as activism, specifically in the social media spaces. So one thing that I notice is that, there are most of these Tamil nationalist activists, they see, like, only the national question as the main problem that that people in Sri Lanka are facing, and it's always about like, how the Tamils are marginalized and how their right to self-determination is crushed, and how and why there should be some international investigation into the war crimes or the genocide that happened in 2009. So what I see is, like, for instance, I don't see people recognizing other struggles that are taking place. And even if a Sinhala nationalist political party is voted to power, that is always interpreted as there is a lot of Sinhala racism. So people don't seem to recognize that there are economic reasons why people are disillusioned with certain regimes, and maybe they have expectations that certain other regimes would deliver. So those complexities are not taken into consideration sometimes. So now, like, in this election, what happened was there are also, like, the so-called Sinhala nationalist parties got a lot of support in the Northeast too. Right? There were in Jaffna alone, like nearly 90,000 votes. SLPP and SLFP and EPDP got, like, they are seen as allies of the government. So then, like, I think this is a moment that would also tell the activists, transnational activists, that, so let's say, like, even Tamils seem to think that economic issues need to be given so much importance. So there may be, like, economic reasons why, in the South, people are voting for change, voting for a regime. I don't know whether they will deliver. I don't know about that, but I hardly think that they will deliver. But there is a reason. Like, there are also economic reasons. But those issues don't figure in the activism. And then one other thing that I noticed was their understanding of Southern society is so limited. So it's like, they look at Southern society only through the prism of ethnicity or nationalism. So that is also happening. And then they are also quite interested in internationalizing the whole issue. So for them, investigating in the genocide or the war crimes is so important, because that might lead to succession. So I think this is again an interesting point that Mamdani makes in his book, that you see these, political violence and political processes, you reduce them to some crimes, and then you persecute the people who are involved in the crime. But then again, you hope that that persecution or the justice will lead to a similar nation state structure, then you are not really making any progress, right? There is no political or systemic change or paradigmatic change happening. So I think it is because of those reasons. I think I find some of this nationalist, diasporic, or transnational activism quite limited, and they don't seem to recognize non-ethnicity concerns that Tamils have, and then their understanding of other communities is very, very limited. And then I also don't see any interest on their part to bring together communities. I think they are contributing more and more to keep the communities divided. So I don't know whether I addressed your question, but these are certain things that I observe, especially on the social media spaces. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, silent.
Yeah, no, Thiru, thank you for that, very interesting talk and how you've brought in Mamdani and kind of to sort of interrogate or to unpack some of these concepts, right? So, and I guess what I'm getting at, I feel this is kind of really important stuff that has to be done in terms of understanding the kind of ideological underpinnings, right? In the sense that I would tend to agree with, for example, Marxist historians like Eric Hobsbawm, who say that it is nationalism that created nations, right? Nationalism as an ideology that creates and reproduces nations, rather than saying that there is something essential as a nation that produce nationalist ideology, right? So which comes first? And I think that's very important. And I think Hobsbawm's intervention there is very important, right? So, and because what we have gotten used to is a certain orthodoxy or dogma where we stick to certain, as Marxists, we stick to certain categories without willing to interrogate them or to rethink them, in the sense that, so the nation in the way in which Stalin kind of reified it, right? And then, and that got linked to this ideal of right to self-determination, and almost becomes unquestionable. Any kind of discussion of nationalism and the right to self-determination has to go back to the Lenin-Luxemburg debate, and doesn't allow us to move further. But I think what we need to do is kind of constantly think of ways, because we are still captives of that, right? That we assume that a nation is a given thing. It's not something that as a category that emerges historically at a certain point, that it's shaped by certain ideologies and how we are going to look at that. And as you were talking, maybe you're probably aware of this, I was reminded of Professor Kailasapati, I think, who was also with early on with Shanmudasan and them in the Communist Party, right? At least a fellow traveler. And he wrote this essay because you were talking about consciousness, right? And about Tamil consciousness. And I think you probably are aware of this essay in Ethnicity and Social Change, where Kailasapati has an article titled, and I just pulled it up as you were speaking, so I just want to read a paragraph from it, called The Cultural and Linguistic Consciousness of the Tamil Community, right? So he delivers this in 1979 at SSA conference in Colombo. And I'll just read out this one paragraph, if you can indulge me that.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, the quote, "The cultural nationalism of Tamils is today at the crossroads. It has two options before it: to tread the path of cultural isolation and chauvinism, or to identify those features that are also common to the majority community and work out a democratic way of life. The choice would appear to be obvious, but to do that would also mean a national struggle by both communities, obfuscating the veil of narrow ethnic interests and marching towards a social order in which there will be no exploitation of man by man." I mean, he's still working with his kind of time then, right? Of this kind of emergence of a very powerful kind of nationalism. This is at the, at the turn of the armed struggle and so on. but he's able to kind of unpack what's going on in the Tamil community, right? So for him, what's important there is the differences between the Batiklo Tamils, the Jaffna Tamils, the caste differences. So he's able to bring all of that, and he's questioning this kind of dangerous trajectory that the Tamil community is about to embark on at a very kind of, at the moment, right? Before this whole tragedy unfolds. So I think this kind of interrogation of concepts, right? And he's doing it at that, and we continue to have to do that. And so, and just one other thing that came up about this use of the term minorities, right? I think some of us were part of this discussion on thinking in terms of minorities consensus. And I think in these concepts itself, ideologically, there is power, right? I'm not talking about like the very kind of minority rights, or, and that's my problem with law and international law and this idea of self-determination right, you know, and how we think about its kind of, you know, as law and legal underpinnings as well, right? But not just right as a norm, and how we get entrenched in it as what's happened. So the idea of minorities, you know, we can even draw from like Tamil kind of activism of Thiruvarangan Tamilar Iyakam, right? The anti-caste movement, which saw them as minority Tamils, right? What does minority Tamils mean? And they were not talking about Tamils as a minority within Sri Lanka. They're talking about minority Tamils, right? And it had a very kind of a emancipatory vision tied to that. So to kind of constantly rethink these concepts, I think are very important, and to look at the kind of political power in those concepts as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to raise something related.
Yeah.
Related to what Agilan says, but rethinking. I mean, I'm also a little amazed that today that we are talking of nation, nationalism, and its viability without talking of a community whose claim to nationhood is very fraught and fragile. That's the Muslim community. I mean, we are stuck, I think, in this duality of Sinhala Tamil, and being stuck there, or because we are stuck with the idea of nation, we are stuck with this, territorial nationalism. I mean, if you look at the articulation of the state, Sri Lankan state, and the articulation of counter-articulations of Muslim nationhood, it's so fraught. Nothing really is emerging out of it. And what we have is either at one end Islamophobia, I mean, which is passive, and the liberals and the left have no answer, are not even discussing it. And I think we have to talk about that if you're going to talk about Tamils or Sinhalese. And then the road to unpacking this will become really, will take us on a different path. And I think that's where, and I think this polarization is also kind of like a mantra kind of thing, I mean, yes, people are polarized, but so I mean, kind of, okay, I'll stop there. I mean, we have to talk about the Muslim community if you're going to talk about nations, because otherwise we are not seeing where we can go.
Yeah, I agree, Sumati, that there are certain articulations of Muslim nationhood and the Olival Declaration that came up in the 2000s, I think, when the LTT was very violent in the East and when the peace process was underway. But there is also a demand, like, sometimes
but none of it went anywhere.
No,
the unity
yeah,
of devolution, none of it's here.
Yeah, it didn't go anywhere. I agree. But then there is also this expectation again from Tamil nationalists that, Muslims also have to say that they are a nation. So then it's easy, like, that is also I think that I find that also very problematic. Like, they have to also define themselves in those terms and make the same claims as Tamils do. make territorial claims. I don't know whether they say territorial claims, but this is something that is expected sometimes of the Muslim community. So
yeah, I also think that for a fundamental rethink, I mean, it might be interesting to, it kind of put that on the table.
Right.
Yeah. Otherwise we are really stuck in this kind of a binary.
Yeah.
Which is detrimental to everything, even our own minorities like Tamil, Sinhalese, Buddhists, all are minorities, and Muslims, Burghers.
Yeah, and I think the eviction is, in a way, I think it complicates that binary also in an interesting way. I think it's a violent event, but it does is like, this is a problem within the whole claims that Tamil nationalism makes, and the question of diversity within one's territories.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
I mean, Sumati and Mahendran, I think the Tamil nationalist questions are territorial, but the Muslim claim is not territorial. It is global. It is not restricted to any particular nation, state, or a territory. It is a global phenomena, and that is how they think, because that's a belief based on their belief system. So there is a difference between the Tamil national question and the Muslim. I don't think that as a national question. It's an international. It's a global reaction to neoliberalism. That's how I see the difference.
Okay. So where are they going to build the nation?
That is, well, yeah, Iraq, Iran, and then, it's the whole of the world, non-believers. So the believers are the nation.
Any other questions?
Non-believers are not.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Well, now we talk about a lot of things about Lenin and his definition of national self-determination. But Hobsbawm once said on the question of right of self-determination, people can take only pragmatic judgment. You can't just say yes or no. So it depends on the concrete situation. That's what he said. That's not my question. My question is, you emphasize the importance of demographic changes that has been taking place in Sri Lanka in the last 30, 40 years. And in that situation, your conclusion, if I read correctly, is it's very difficult to have a idea of national form or the nation state formation as far as Tamil Elam or Muslim something in the east or in singular south. If it is the question in other sense, if the nationhood or the concept of nation is not a sufficient reason for united struggle, then what would be the factor that allows us to, people to, can we take the issue of land? Can we take the issue of water? Can we take the issue of kind of other national resources? I mean, we need something that can unite people if the nationality is not a factor that can unite. It was at some point, but now at the same, now what we can see is it is not the concept of nation is not a very strong ground for to build some kind of unity either in the north or in the south. So in that case, we have to find out another uniting principle, the principle for unity. So what's the kind of thing that we can think of in the absence of the concept of nation?
I think this is where I find the term coexistence very useful. Like, this understanding that there may be differences, but then the need to live together, and
But
also
you need
how
something
we,
tangible.
but also like, it is also going to be in relation to land, in relation to resources, how we are going to distribute. I think that the processes of distribution also, like, in certain ways shouldn't exacerbate the divisions that happen, that we see happening here now. So what kind of coexistence in terms of in material terms, in symbolic terms, in cultural terms, we can evolve? I think that is something that we have to sort of work towards, I think. So that I would say maybe like, one other banner or keyword that we can invoke in order to bring together communities. And the idea of sharing and our commitment to one another in terms of security, justice.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Right. I think peaceful coexistence even during the Soviet Union. I mean, under Stalin, they had peaceful coexistence with the capitalist countries. So it's a problem for me. Peaceful coexist. You can peacefully coexist with now the USA peacefully coexists with Saudi Arabia, right? So is that what you're talking about?
No.
So what I'm trying to say is that we must advocate universal values like justice, freedom, equality. So equality has to be across all nationalities, genders, and castes, and etc. and etc. So you can peacefully coexist with totalitarian regimes and democratic regimes. They have been peacefully coexisting, but that is I think is not the way I think that we should advocate for, right?
No,
Can I say one thing, Thiru?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So you can, I think you can respond to both, because also, Sumani's question about, what might replace the nation. I would turn the question around, right? In terms of what has happened, is that, those who work on struggles for land, for water, even workers' rights, even the left, right? What the experience tells us is that nationalist ideology is so explosive that it attracts people there, right? So, for example, even if you look at like the Nepali Maoists, for example, right, when the Madheshi problem came up, a lot of them split and they took up nationalism because Marxists and leftists try very hard to work around on so many of these struggle on so many of these issues, and they're unable to mobilize enough. They bring in nationalism and they're able to mobilize. So that's the challenge, that nationalism has this way of mobilizing people to be able to create nations, to be able to, and that's his power. So when we're thinking of replacing it, we also have to be always conscious of the kind of its gravity, right? To be able to mobilize. Sorry, just
Well, it is, it's right. I mean, it's a very attractive ideology. But the point is, if you look at the Sri Lankan history, until 1970s, early 1970s, Sri Lankan left was able to mobilize people without this kind of attractive political ideology. In fact, going against it. That is mainly because they took some other issues which are primarily important for Sinhala, Muslim, and Tamil, all kind of groups. But things have changed when there is a decline in the left in 1964 as a part of the coalition government with the SLP or the Sinhala nationalist groupings.
Yes, I think there are issues that can unite communities. I think, like economic issues maybe, but for me, I think we can't also sidestep this sort of nationalism that we observe, like the nationalism that comes from the state or the nationalism that comes from the Tamil nationalist communities. So it's like, okay, let's ignore this problem and work on other issues is also like, I don't know whether that is the way forward. Maybe we have to tackle this issue also, maybe through education, maybe through dialogue, and how to liberate the state from this, liberate the state and society from these nationalist forces. I think that's also important. I think there will be consensus on all these issues like economy and free health and free education and all that. But how are we going to, like, make everybody accept that we share this space with other people, or we share this island with other people, and where other people also can practice their cultures, faiths, languages without any hindrance. So that dialogue, I think, needs to happen while other dialogues go on.
You have 5 minutes more. You can entertain one more question or comments.
Hi, this is Terence. Hello?
Yeah.
So interestingly, this question that came up in a workshop way back in 2000, I think Berghoff, they organized that workshop, interreligious workshop. And the question was, what brings all the communities together? There was a Buddhist monk, and his immediate answer was natural disasters, like tsunami, those kind of things. So he immediately said that only natural disasters bring all the communities together.
True, but I think there are also these natural disasters also unfold amidst existing inequalities, and how people experience it, how relief is given to people. And now there is a pandemic, and we can see how this pandemic in a way is inflected by all these inequalities, right? And the burial rights of the Muslim community. And
so look at the Buddhist, let's have more natural disasters then.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shall we conclude now? Okay, on behalf of the Marx School, I thank you. Thanks, Thiru, for making a very good presentation. And also, I think today we had the maximum number of people in the Marx School, I think about 45. And I invite all of you to participate in future Marx School events. We have Sinhala, Tamil and English, all 3 languages. So inviting everybody to participate in Marx School discussions. We will stop today's sessions now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thiru. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Thiru, sir. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night.